All right, so for our final meeting, what we are going to talk about is ecosystem and climate change. Yesterday, I hold here a brief meeting, not brief actually, because it was 1 hour. And then we talked about communities. And I didn't start talking about ecosystem because I always believe that ecosystems and climate change is kind of like one drags the other. That's why it's always beneficial to have them talk together. So that's what we are going to do today. Yesterday I was reviewing the video that I posted from yesterday's class, and I actually should have warned you that I was really sleep deprived, and so my thought was really slow. That's not very different from today. So bear with me, and you might think that I'm taking some time to process the ideas, and that's completely true because I am. But we are going to do it, and it's our last day. So for ecosystems and climate change, this is our learning objectives. Basically, where we are interested in knowing how the energy flow through the ecosystems. And then we are going to see why and how we can interpret one productivity pyramid and the biomagnification as well. And we are going to work a lot with net primary productivity, and that is also going to link to our global climate change because we can study climate change based on how humans are changing the use of net primary productivity. And then we're going to have, or we're going to see the effects of climate change on organisms and different ecosystems. So what are the main components of one ecosystem? How can we kind of like define ecosystem if that's a thing? One ecosystem is going to be made of two main components. The first one, it is the communities that we're going to have there. And we saw that a community is going to be several populations, different species interacting with each other. And we saw a lot about how those species can interact. So those are also part of an ecosystem. It is one of the components. So several communities interacting, living in one region. But then we also have an abiotic component that we should take in consideration when we are talking about an ecosystem. Those two components, they are going to be linked by two things: the flow of energy and the cycling of nutrients. So nutrients, energy and nutrients, it's what it's going to be moving from the biotic and the abiotic components of an ecosystem, and it's going to link those two things and make the ecosystem complete. In this course, what we are interested to understand, it is the flow of energy. We are not going to be discussing the cycling of nutrients, but we know that that's also part of the ecosystem, and it's one of the things that link both abiotic and biotic components together. So if we are talking about energy, we need to understand how energy enters in the ecosystem, how it starts in the system. And we already studied photosynthesis, so we know that through primary producers, the autotrophs, the organisms that are able to produce their own food from inorganic sources, that is how the energy is going to enter the system or the ecosystem. We give photosynthesis as an example, but we should remember that that's not the only way that we have. We do have organisms that use other types of inorganic sources to produce energy. For example, in the deep vents, there is still a way to put some energy in the system. But no matter what process we are using for this energy to enter the system, the main one being photosynthesis, we need to remember that energy is not being created. We can only transform the energy from one source to another. So in the case of photosynthesis, we are transforming the energy stored in the solar light to the chemical energy in the form of sugars. And that is how mainly the process of photosynthesis occurs. Once this energy enters the system, we have to define a few things here to understand how we are going to quantify the system. So we are going to talk about primary productivity. If it is energy, it is being converted from the sunlight through the primary producers. What those organisms are producing, it is our primary productivity. So the total amount of chemical energy, so the total productivity of one area in one time period, it is what we call the gross primary productivity. But primary producers, they are organisms, they should be kept alive, and so they have some need of energy as well. So let's say, for example, a plant. A plant, it is alive, so it needs energy to keep that body alive. It needs energy for cellular respiration and for growing as well. So when this gross primary productivity, when we have it as a whole, we have to kind of like discount or use, or actually the primary producers is going to use part of this gross primary productivity for cellular respiration to produce the ATP, which is going to fuel the metabolic processes. So everything that that body needs in order to be alive. Other part of this gross primary productivity, it is what the organism is going to use to grow and to reproduce. And so this energy, it is what is going to be available in the form of biomass. That's going to be available for the next trophic level. And this is what we call net primary productivity. So we usually represent this as GPP and NPP. So gross primary productivity, it is the total. Net primary productivity, it is after we remove the part that it's used for cellular respiration and to fuel that body, to keep the body alive. Here it is just a summary quantifying how much of the total solar energy it is actually transformed into gross primary productivity and then net primary productivity. And it is really interesting to see that from the whole amount of solar energy available, primary producers can only use 0.8% of that and transform it into gross primary productivity. So it's a very, very tiny amount of the available solar energy that it's converted into gross primary productivity. From this 0.8%, 55% of those are going to be used for cellular respiration, or because those metabolic processes are not perfect, we are going to have some of this energy also lost through the system in the form of heat and also the waste products of organisms. So 55% of the gross primary productivity, it is actually spent by the primary producer. Only 45% it is invested in growth and reproduction, and that is what it is our net primary productivity, because it is what is going to be available for the next organism to feed on, and so the energy is going to move like this. So very small proportion of the sunlight energy, it's actually converted, or it's going to be actually transported from one level to another. Here's a summary of all of those names and how we can represent it in the form of an equation. So if we are trying to calculate our net primary productivity, we are going to have to take into account the gross primary productivity and subtracted the respiration and the loss, and loss in the case of metabolic processes losing some energy through the system in the form of heat. So net primary productivity, it is what results in biomass, and it is the total amount of chemical energy that it's stored in organic material. So these, to make it easier to remember, it's pretty much like our salaries. The gross salary that we make per year or month, it is the gross primary productivity. So it's our gross salary. But you have to pay taxes, you have to pay health insurance. So some of that energy, some of that salary, it's actually spent to yourself to maintain that job and everything. After you deduct all the taxes, you have the net primary salary, which is what you can spend to yourself and to your kids, for example, if you do have them. That is your net salary, so net primary productivity. Once this energy enters the system, what it happens to this biomass? What it happens with the leaves of the plants that transform the light of the sun in energy, in chemical energy? So they grew and they formed those leaves. They produced offspring, so they produced new plants. And now we are going to have primary consumers eating those leaves, and so on and so forth. And so we are going to have our food chain taking place here. And we discussed the food chain yesterday, and we saw that depending on which level, which type of food one organism is going to consume, it's going to put it in a different trophic level. So we start here with primary producers, which are the ones that is going to convert the energy. So it's from where the energy it is entering the ecosystem. As we move up in trophic levels, we are going to see that the energy that we have, it is decreasing. We are moving the energy up in trophic levels. In each of those levels, as the energy pass here, we are going to have some being lost or dissipated through the ecosystem in the form of heat. So remember that we said that the biotic and abiotic components of an ecosystem are linked through energy and nutrients. So nutrients, on the other hand, they are constantly flowing between the organisms and the abiotic environment. They are not lost from the system like the energy it is lost through the system. That is the difference between the two components of the ecosystem. But as I said before, we are not going to go into details here on how the nutrients are cycled. It depends on each nutrient. We are only interested in this other part here, which deals with the energy. So as I said, the energy moves trophic levels. As we move up in trophic levels, we are going to have less and less energy being moved. And that brings us to this pyramid of productivity, which quantifies how much energy it is transferred to the next trophic level. And that transferring, it is made through the transfer of biomass. So in general, we are going to see that the efficiency of this biomass transfer from one trophic level to another, it is only 10%. In other words, from all the biomass produced by this primary producer here, only 10% of the energy contained on that, it is going to be transformed or transferred to the primary consumer. Only 10% of that is going to go to the secondary consumer and tertiary and so on and so forth. So in other words, 90% of that energy is actually used by the own organism. It is used as cellular respiration, or it is lost from the system and excreted as well. And this is something that you may be thinking, like, why is this important? Well, one of the things we can think about when we study this is that depending on which level you choose to feed in the food chain, you can be more or less efficient. And I'm not going to go into a discussion here about like different types of diet, but think about what type of energy transforming or transferring you are doing when you eat a salad, for example, or when you eat tuna, for example. And so you are going to start understanding that depends on where we choose to feed, we are being more or less efficient in terms of energy transfer. So if energy transfer it's actually decreasing as we move up in our trophic levels, on the other hand, pollutants, so toxic substance, they actually increase as you move up in trophic levels. Why that's the case? Because all these toxic substances, pollutants, they occur and they are not going to be eliminated from your body, from our bodies. They are just going to get concentrated as we move up. Remember that we need 10 parts of one trophic level, like the trophic level below. Let's talk about primary producers. We need 10 parts of primary producers to produce one part of a primary consumer. If that's the case, everything here that it's in those 10 parts of the primary producers, it is going to be concentrated in one part of a primary consumer. So you are just every time you move up, you are taking a high amount of pollutants and putting it in a small part. And as you do that, you are concentrating it more and more and more and more. One of the consequences of this, it's again, for example, for humans in our diets. I don't know if you know that, but pregnant woman shouldn't be eating fish, which is high in mercury. So for example, tuna. Why is that so? Because tuna, it's going to feed in sardines. Sardines is going to feed on another thing. So we are talking about a tertiary consumer. And so the levels of mercury in that tuna, it's really high. If that's the case, think that you are generating a human being. And so you are concentrating that even more, and that can be very toxic. And like that, we have several different examples on how this can be problematic, not only for humans, but for all the organisms. So as we decrease the amount of energy, we're going to need every time more of that biomass to produce the next level. And as we are doing this, we are concentrating the amount of pollutants that comes together with that biomass, since that is not excreted from the bodies. So biomagnification, it's harmful for humans, not only in this example that I just described, but here's another one. And if you want to know more details about, there is this link in the slides that is going to take you to this article. And it's really interesting to read about this experiment. But basically this protein here, PGP, it occurs naturally in the cells of most animals and most organisms, plants as well, and in humans as well. And this protein is very well known to protect our cells because it removes all the toxins that are trying to enter the cells. And one of the things that this protein also do, they remove the drugs that is trying to enter cancer cells, and that it's one of the reasons why some types of cancer are really resistant to the treatments, because of this same protein here. And what they tested, it is how those pollutants that is found in fish, and it's also found in flame retardants and things like upholsteries, carpets and things like this, how is that influencing our ability to eliminate toxins? And what we saw is that this most of these pollutants, they actually bind to the PGP and avoid or does not let the protein to work properly. And so we are just risking to be overloaded with substance that it's going to not allow our bodies to defend ourselves by eliminating the normal toxins that we would need to. So have a look in this article. It's really a very interesting example of how biomagnification can be really harmful to humans as well. Now, when we talk about the net primary productivity, we have to understand that net primary productivity is not going to be the same in all the regions in the world. It is going to be very different. And here is an example of the map and showing the net primary productivity in the different regions in the world. And how we're going to read this map is that when you remove from the black, purplish, here we are towards the red, we are increasing the net primary productivity in that particular place. So things like yellow, green, and red are the ones that will produce more energy, and so are the highest net primary productivity that we have, while the purple and black ones are the lowest net primary productivity produced. So by just looking through this globe map here, where do you think net primary productivity it is higher? In the land, on the land, or in the seas? So in those regions or in the continents that we have here. So you probably should agree with me that most of the sea, it is going to be purple and black. So we are going to say that, as Sarah is saying here, on the land, it is where we have the higher net primary productivity being produced. And why is that the case? Well, because on the land, it's where we have most of the sunlight being available. Remember when we were talking about, I forgot what was the photosynthesis, no, transition from water to the land, that we said that the algae did not have to worry much about being exposed to the sunlight because they were underwater. And so the water column is going to absorb most of the wavelengths that it's actually used. And so they would not be, that wouldn't be harmful for them. On the other hand, when you are exposed to the sun rays and the land, you are much more, receiving much more of that sunlight. And this is one of the reasons why net primary productivity it's much higher on the land. You have much more sunlight available, so you can convert that in energy. Now, just talking about the continent, so just the land, we also see that net primary productivity is going to be different depending on the place where you are. And so if we observe very well here and look for places with like yellow, greenish, and red colors, we are going to see that here in the middle of the globe, it's where we are going to have the greatest net primary productivity on land. And that it's exactly where we have our wet tropics, and with exception of the deserts like we have here, the tropics is where we're going to have most of our net primary productivity on the land. And why is that the case? Again, because of the availability of the sunlight. And another thing, it's because of the average of temperatures. Usually it's higher in this place and it's more suitable for the proteins to perform photosynthesis. As we move through from the tropics towards the poles, we are going to have a reduction, a decrease in that average temperature. And so we're gonna decrease also our land primary productivity. Now, if we move to understand or to analyze what is going on our oceans in the marine ecosystems, also is going to have some different areas. We're going to have areas almost black like these ones here, where we almost have no primary productivity. But if we observe around the coastal lines here, it's where we're going to have most of the bluish colors. And there is where our net primary productivity is going to be higher in the marine ecosystem, so in the coastal lines. And why that's the case, why we have coastal lines being more productive? Well, you can start thinking that first, it is closer to the land, and we know that on land, primary productivity, it is higher. But the reason why the coastal lines are better in producing energy than deep sea, for example, it's because here it's where we have most of the rivers coming out, bringing the water that was on the land, and so bringing nutrients to that. And also because of the upwelling movement of the currents. So what is the upwelling movement? It's basically the water that is richer in nutrients, it stays in the bottom, close to the bottom of the sea. And the current, it's going to move that water up to the surface, close to the coastal lines here. So it brings, and then when it matches the coastal line, it's going to be up and bring this nutrient-rich water. And so phytoplanktons, organisms that makes photosynthesis in the oceans, will be able to use or to grow better because they have more nutrients. So basically, the availability of nutrients in the coastal lines is what is going to make it more or better in producing energy. Greatest net primary productivity will be there. Now, if we analyze it globally, we are also going to see that net primary productivity, it is going to change and vary globally. And it's not only that it is going to be different depending if you are on sea and on land, but net primary productivity, it has been changing a lot how it used to be and how it is being now. So here is a map showing the change in net primary productivity only on land. And how we read this is everything that is bluish color means that you decreased the net primary productivity from 2000 to 2014. In 14 years, you decreased the amount of net primary productivity that you had. everything that is greenish, you actually increased the amount of net primary productivity on those places. So if here is the equator, so we have the north hemisphere and the south hemisphere, do you agree that most of the north hemisphere it's kind of like more greenish, and then most of the south hemisphere it's more bluish? If that is the case, we are going to say that everything that is greenish, it is actually increasing net primary productivity. So in just 14 years, what we observed is that net primary productivity, it increased in the north hemisphere, and it actually decreased in the south hemisphere. And this wouldn't be so much surprising to have an increase in net primary productivity if you think about the emissions of carbon dioxide, which increased a lot. So if you have more carbon dioxide, you can expect that you are going to be able to perform more photosynthesis. And that is what is happening here in the North Hemisphere. But so why we would have a decrease in the South Hemisphere? And if we balance both here, believe it or not, we're going to say that overall we had a decrease in net primary productivity on the world. And why that's the case if we are seeing an increase in the North Hemisphere? Because even though we had an increase here, the decrease in the South Hemisphere was so much more pronounced that made it the balance to be negative, and we are decreasing it. And why it decreased in the South Hemisphere? Because of the drought. So drought, it's so severe in most of the places in the South Hemisphere that what we are seeing, it is a very strong decrease in net primary productivity, especially in regions that are very important for production of net primary productivity. So overall, on land, net primary productivity, it is decreasing. And what about in the oceans? How net primary productivity is changing in the oceans? Naturally, in normal situations, what we are going to have in the oceans, it is a thing like this, and I've already talked about the upwelling movement of the waters. And what that means is that on closer to the bottom of the sea, it's where you have the colder water. Being colder, that water, it is denser, but it's also nutrient rich because it's close to the sediments. And close to the surface, the water is warmer because it is where the sunlight it is reaching easier. And because it is warmer, it is less dense. But the current of water, it is able to bring this nutrient-rich water, overcoming this gradient of density of water here. Now, what is happening, it is that we are going to have an increasing in the temperature of the water in the ocean. So the water is much warmer, and as a consequence, it's much more less dense. It's less dense than the one that was full of nutrients. As a consequence, the currents are not strong enough, it's not able to overcome this difference that we have here. We no more have a kind of like a gradient of temperature. We just have a very less dense and a very dense water. And so the dense water cannot overcome this difference in density. And so the nutrients are not arriving here in the upper layer of water, where most of the photosynthesis take place, because it's where we have sunlight arriving. And as a consequence, we can expect that net primary productivity, it is also decreasing in the oceans overall. So on land and in the oceans, net primary productivity, it is decreasing, even though we saw an increase on land in the North Hemisphere. Net primary productivity does not vary only in large scale, land and ocean, but also inside the different ecosystems. So here, different biomes showing how net primary productivity, it is different in each of those. And we have things like coral reefs, we have tropical forests, and until we get to open oceans and things like this. How we read this graph? the very first column here, it is showing to us what is the productivity, net primary productivity per unit of area. So how productive is each of those environments? Look of coral reefs. So the coastal lines where we mostly have those coral reefs, look how productive are those environments. It's even more productive than tropical forests. So Amazon, for example, it is an example of a wet tropical forest. It's a very productive environment, and we know that. But coral reefs per unit of area, it is even more productive environment. And then in our second column, we have the area of the earth that it's covered by this type of ecosystem. Unfortunately, very tiny amount of our earth it's actually covered with coral reefs. But we do have a significant amount of that coverage by our tropical forests. And even more significant, we have here open oceans that are very unproductive, if we can say like this, but covers most of Earth's surface. We have it like around 65% of Earth is covered by the oceans. If we multiply the area covered by the net primary productivity per unit, we are going to have what is the contribution of each of those environments to our total net primary productivity, to the global net primary productivity. And when we do that, it's really interesting to observe that things very productive like coral reefs, they actually contribute very small amount to our global net primary productivity. The tropical wet forests, it's actually contributing to around 25%. And even though open oceans are very unproductive, it's not a lot of productivity per unit of area because it covers a lot of our earth. We are going to see that it's also responsible for most or for almost the same amount as our tropical forests to our net primary productivity. So why is this important? When we are thinking about conserving ecosystems for purposes of energy, we have to take in considerations what is the area that we are going to conserve. Usually, we cannot protect very dense, long areas and make it in protection. So by knowing which environments are the most productive ones, we are kind of like focusing on the ones that is highly productive. So we know that we are conserving a lot of our productivity. Think about if you have to, even though like open oceans, they contribute to 25% of the total net primary productivity. But if you were to conserve that, you would have to conserve 65% of the Earth's surface, which is not doable to do. But on the other hand, if you conserve the coral reefs, you are actually conserving a very productive area, the same way of a tropical forest, for example. And that is exactly what a lot of initiatives are doing to revert or to try to cope with the effects of our climate change. So here's an example of this blue carbon. And blue carbon, it's basically the carbon that is stored in the coastal and marine ecosystems. So things like mangroves, seagrasses, all the carbon that those places absorb and actually have stored in the sediments and in the corals and the organisms that lives there. That is what we call blue carbons. So this consortium, what they are trying to do, it is to protect most of this sea line, the coastal lines, because we know that those environments are highly productive. And when those environments, they are conserved, they work as sink of carbons because they absorb most of the carbon and helps coping with the climate change, because we are going to see in a minute that carbon dioxide, it's one of the problems that it's causing this climate to change a lot. On the other hand, if you do not protect those environments and they start to be destroyed, remember that a lot of those environments, they are covered with things like coral reefs, which uses a lot of the carbon in their skeletons. And so if you destroy this, instead of capturing carbon dioxide, you are actually contributing to put even more carbon dioxide in our atmosphere. So the blue carbon, it is this, what they are trying to do, it is to conserve most of our coastal lines in hope to conserve the places where most of the carbon dioxide it is being absorbed. And this brings us to the impact that humans have on primary net primary productivity, which makes the link from ecosystems to our climate change. And we are going to get to the point where we are going to discuss climate change by passing through this net primary productivity. So what humans are doing with the net primary productivity, it's actually one appropriation of most of this energy that should be actually available for all the species that lives together with us in this planet. In this map here that it's from this paper, even though it is from 2004, I checked the most recent one and it didn't change much. It actually just stayed a little bit worse. This map, it is representing how much of the net primary productivity from that specific place. So if we are here in the Northeast, how much of the net primary productivity produced in this area humans are using. And so as we move from like the blue air, from the blue color towards the yellow and then until the purple, we are seeing that humans are using most or even much more of the energy produced in those places than that place actually produces. So on the orange, which is mostly like here and some of the most populous areas here in the Northeast as well, we are already using 100% of the energy, the net primary productivity produced in those places. Why is this a problem? Well, because other species would need that energy as well. And if we are in places using even like 40,000%, means that we are not only using what is being produced locally, but also in other areas that are not using it at all. Obviously, we have to consider that in things like in the Amazon and then the deserts, we are not using because there are less humans living in those places. And so the impact of humans in that primary productivity, it's one of the things that we take in account when we are talking about climate change. And so now we are already moving in talking and gonna talk about climate change. And one of the things that we have to understand very well when we talk about climate change, it is the difference between climate and weather. And to do that, we are going to watch a short video. What is the difference between climate and weather? We are not going to watch the whole thing, but just a first part of it.
Hello, it's me. I've been watching people talking about climatology, and they're wrong about everything. They say that winters are so cold, so climate can be changing. Oh no, can you see that this type of argument is an informal fallacy? Don't generalize so hastily. There's 6 major climate zones on Earth, not just the one you see. There's such a difference between weather and climate, so let's give it a try. Weather changes all the time, and climate is the average line. It's not simple, really, because they're two different things. Weather changes daily, climate lasts centuries. Weather changes all the time, and climate is the average line. It's not simple, really. Remember this analogy. Climate is to a meal, weather is to groceries. It's not hard.
Okay, I guess that's enough. Another important discrimination that we have to do, it is about what is global climate change and global warming, because sometimes people think that those two terms, they are interchangeable, but they are actually different things. So they refer to the same thing, but it's to the same phenomenon, but it's different emphasis. In other words, we are going to have climate change, including global warming, but it's not only global warming. So global warming, it is just the increase in the average temperature on the planet. And climate change, it goes much beyond that. It's not only the global warming. Global warming is one of the factors, and we have a lot of things happening as well. So for example, we have the sea levels is rising, shrinking mountain glaciers, we have accelerating melt, ice melt, and so on and so forth, shifts in the flowers. So I would say a lot of the consequences also of global warming. So climate change includes global warming, but it's not only global warming. We are saying a lot of things. And climate, it does not it does not refer only to the temperatures, but also makes reference to the amount of precipitations that we have, winds, and all of the other aspects that it's included in the climate as well. Now, what is the deal with the climate change? What is happening that it's making this climate to change? There are two very good videos that I posted on Brightspace. I like them very much to explain all the reasons and everything else. And one of the things that they discuss that it is the greenhouse effect. And what exactly it is the greenhouse effect? So we know that the sunlight is going to reach the earth. Some of this energy is going to be reflected back, and some of those energy is going to be in the system, and we are going to use it and transform in our net primary productivity. What is happening with climate change and what is happening with this greenhouse effect is that we are going to have a lot of substances, gases in our atmosphere that it's actually absorbing most of the heat that it's going to be reflected back, and instead of going back to the out of the atmosphere, this heat is being trapped in our atmosphere and causing the earth to warm. Here is some of the examples of this greenhouse gases. We have water vapor, nitrous oxide, methane, and carbon dioxide. And we know that all of those gases, they are actually naturally occurring in the nature, in the atmosphere. And it much more, or it predates, it happens much time before humans. So what is the actual problem here? Why we are making such a big deal with things that already exist in the atmosphere and already happened before humans were in this planet? Well, it is true that all of this carbon dioxide and all of this gases were there, and their levels change often in our environments. But the problem here, it is not that is being changed. It is just the amount and the speed in which it is happening. So if we look through the levels of carbon dioxide, we're going to see that in the past, it did have some variations and it went up and down throughout the years before today. But what happened right after the Industrial Revolution, it is a peak, and it crossed this line that never been above it before, with emissions of carbon dioxide reaching levels that nowadays it's skyrocketed, it's much higher than these ones here. So The speed in which things are happening, it is what is worrisome, not the things that are changing. Change does occur, but never before it changed so fast. In these two maps here, what we can observe, it is how the temperatures are changing in from 2002 to 2016. And we are seeing how much carbon dioxide it is being accumulated in the atmosphere, and here the change in temperature. And it is kind of like unbelievable to see, and I can play this again, how much just in this span of like 14 years, how much we changed the concentration of carbon dioxide in our atmosphere to the level of like being uh, completely red all over the world. Temperature is also not different, and we can see that how much cooler the whole planet was before if we compare with much more recent days. So again, we know that these things is happening because we are observing the amount of carbon dioxide that we have in our atmosphere. The temperatures are rising, and when we check the amount of energy of the solar energy, we also know that that changes over time, but it's not enough to explain the fluctuations or the increase in carbon dioxide that we have. So things do change, and this is normal in nature, but the speed in which it is changing, it is what makes things so problematic. So what is the actual problem here? We know what is happening, and we know that is happening much faster than before. So when we compare the sources of carbon dioxide in our atmosphere, we know that some of them comes from natural sources. So things, for example, terrestrial environments, the oceans. We saw on the coastal lines where we have most of the carbon dioxide from the world. It's actually stored in those coastal lines in the sediments. And we know that there is some change. The carbon, it does circulate. It's one of the nutrient cycles, does circulate from the atmosphere to those environments. But we have another source of carbon dioxide, which it is the human use. So the land use changed a lot. Now we are having less forests, and so we are putting this carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And one thing that is really like a crucial, it is the use of fossil fuels. So what is the difference here? Even though the natural sources, they do produce a lot of carbon dioxide, they kind of like recycle it and they absorb it as well. On the other hand, the human's source of carbon dioxide does not recycle it. It only puts it out in the atmosphere. So we are increasing the reservoir of the atmospheric carbon dioxide by much more than what naturally would occur. And why is that happening so fast that is creating a problem? For several reasons, but mainly because the human population, it is exploding in size. And we know that is being growing exponentially. And as per our population ecology, we know that that can't be happening forever because we have a limit in the environment. And so logistic growth is there. And soon we are going to reach, if we are not already reaching, the carrying capacity of our of our environment. And we are starting to see things like COVID happening much more. The amount of food that we can produce, how much we are changing the weather in our days, it is all influenced by this. So just to give you one perspective, even though the US represents even only 5% of the world's population, Americans produce 1/7 of the global carbon dioxide emissions. And that all has to do with the amount of fossil fuels that we are using every time more, which does not recycle our carbon dioxide. It just puts it out there. Here's just again a comparison of the natural sources of carbon dioxide with the human sources and the magnitude of that. And again, as I said, what is important here is that even though natural sources does produce carbon dioxide, the production is balanced with the uptake of these same natural sources. On the other hand, we do not have the same uptake here. We only are putting it out there. Now, we are already starting to see the consequences of all of this change. And believe it or not, all of these articles are from this year, and we are seeing the hottest summer ever. And it's almost kind of like we changed the whole country south. We are moving the whole country south. So summers in Philadelphia, they are as hot as it used to be in Atlanta in the past. Summers in Portland in Maine, it is as hot as they used to be in Boston, and Boston is as hot as New York used to be. So we are kind of like moving everything south. We are having the same weather that we had in southern, and as we move down, that is keeps true. And we saw that 2021 had the hottest June ever on record. And what really struck me was that the nation has experienced $8 billion disasters so far this year just because of those heat waves and how hot it is. And here again, explaining, or an article that explains that all of those changes happening could not be happening if it was not by climate change and everything. So we are already experiencing all of those things, all of those effects, but those effects go much further than just like the way we experience summers and winters. We do have 5 biological effects of climate change, and they affect not only humans but all the other species that occurs. We are going to have things like geographical range shifts, phenology, evolutionary adaptation, extinction, and ocean acidification. Let's see if we have a little bit of time, to go over those. So range shifts, what does it mean? If we compare those two maps, the US map, it is the species of trees that used to occur in different areas in the past until 1990, and what it is projected to have. So if we see, we have a wide variety, and it basically depends on the seasons, so the climate in each regions, it's what we use it to have trees covering. But if we predicted to have most of the country covered with oak, so we see how the diversity of those species change. And we are moving up those species to where the climate is now much more similar to what it used to live before. So one example of why this is going to be a problem, it is the mountain pine beetle that used to be limited to the freezing temperatures. But now, because the temperatures is much more mild there, it is being occurring in places where it used to occur before, and it is causing the death in a lot of places where it didn't occur before. So we are changing those temperatures, those places where species occur. And as a consequence, because we know that species interact with each other and that they are all linked together in a web, we can expect a cascade effect, and all those interactions are going to be mismatched, and we are going to have a lot of problems with that. Here's one example of a phenology shift, which happens with this snowshoe shoe hare. So this guy, it keeps its white fur when all the surface it's covered in snow. So it's well disguised in the environment, and so the predators will not be finding those guys very easily. What happening is, in the places where the snowshoe hares occurs, the snow is melting much earlier, and it causes a mismatch with its coat, which now it is completely white, while the environment is not white anymore. So instead of working as a protection, this is actually working to make it more vulnerable, because it's easy to spot one white animal like this in a surface which is not covered anymore with snow. So we are having a mismatch of those organisms. We can expect that the populations of lynx, it's going to be it's going to suffer some interferences as well, because they feed on those snowshoe hares as well. Another consequences of this climate change, evolutionary adaptations, traits that used to be frequent because they gave an advantage, or they would make the fitness of that population higher, it's now giving the species a lower fitness, and then they are becoming less frequent. So one example is this ladybird beetle, that the black morphotype, it is declining because the black color here, it is going to trap much more heat, and so individuals that will have this morphotype will be less likely to reproduce. As a consequence, we are seeing much more of the red type instead of the black one. So the traits that are adapted to a place is also changing. Extinctions is another effect, or another consequence of the climate change, and we are seeing much more species being extincted than before. Again, species going extinct is something normal, it does happen, but the rate in which it's happening, it is what is the problem. So for example, the populations of lizards living in Mexico, we expect, or we observed that around 12% of those populations have gone extinct since 1975, just because they could not adapt to the temperatures that changed a lot. So those phenology shifts, they can also call extinctions. And finally, we have ocean acidification, which I will not go into details on how this happens, but basically the carbon dioxide that is going to react with the water in the interface between the atmosphere and the water, that is going to produce protons, which is acidifying the water. The problem with that is that organisms that uses the carbonate to produce their shells and to produce their bodies, like coral reefs and shellfish that needs this carbonate to make their shells, they are not able to use that anymore in an acidic environment. And even on top of that, what we are going to have is that those organisms, they even going to decalcificate, because the calcium that they use is going to react with those protons produced by carbonate, and the shell of those organisms, it is going to actually fall apart. Let me see if we can play this, which is a simple experiment showing how the increase of carbon dioxide will actually change the pH of one of the water.
So let's see how this works. 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 9, 10, 12, 13, 14. This is a glass of water, and I have just put 20 drops of a pH test into it. That shows what the acidity is of the water. And as you can see, it's turned the water rather blue, which matches roughly this level of pH. Ask unanimous consent to continue with this little demonstration.
Without objection.
This is a very simple bubbler that anybody with an aquarium will recognize. And all you simply do is you put the bubbler in. I produce carbon dioxide as I exhale. So determination that carbon dioxide would warm the planet as it increased its concentration in the atmosphere was figured out around the time of the American Civil War. Opponents of responsible climate action do best in the dark. So I knew that if anything was going to change around here, we'd need to shine some light. I am gravely concerned about climate change. I'm exhaling one breath into this same glass. Do one more. Not even a full breath, but there it is. And now, it used to match that color, do you remember? Now look what color it matches. Just breathing carbon dioxide through the water has changed its pH and has made it more acidic.
So this is just to demonstrate how much a simple thing like breathing in that water changed the carbon dioxide. You can imagine what it could cause the whole ocean being exposed to this much carbon dioxide. We just go back here because I lost the sharing of the, okay, back. And so when we move that in a scale for the whole ocean, we can expect that it's going to scale up pretty fast. And the acidification, it's something really serious. What are the consequences of those? So as I already said, the shells of organisms starts to dissolve in the pH that it's really acidic. It reduces the availability of calcium carbonate because it reacts with this calcium carbonate and produce the bicarbonate that I said, which means that we are going to have a slow growth and even the dissolution with the skeletons. So increasing the acidity affects many processes, not only the skeletons of those things, but also, for example, the ability of larval fish to smell predators and the sperm to swim, to fecundate the eggs and things like this. Not only this is a problem for natural life, but for example, farms, if you are producing shellfish, for example, you should be worried about this. Another consequences of not only ocean acidification, but also the ocean warming of those waters, it is the coral bleaching. So in the coral bleaching, what's happening, it is the algae that lives inside, the protist that lives inside the corals that makes the photosynthesis and gives this coral the food, is going to be expelled by the warming temperature. And as it happens, the coral becomes kind of like naked and has this white color because the color it is given by the protist, the symbiont that lives here. And now this coral is going to die. If the coral is going to die, you can expect that everyone else that lives in the coral will have some consequences as well. On top of that, with the acidification, the corals will also have a hard time making their skeleton because they too use calcium carbonate ions to make those skeletons. So one very brief thing that I want you to finish this course with and to start thinking about is what we can do to, I would say, get back to the place or fix these issues with climate change, because we are getting to a point of no return where we don't matter what we do, we are not going to be able to revert the situation. Here is just a map of the region where we are in, from showing the emissions of this nitrogen dioxide in the atmosphere, what we had in 2015 until the average between 2015 and 2019. So we can see that we had pretty much like around here from 5 to 7.5. And then what was the average in March 2020? was when the pandemic started and we had all the lockdowns in place. You see how much it decreased just because we decreased our activities in those areas. And this is not restricted here to the US. We have other parts of the world. It's the same thing that happened in China, basically the same thing that we observed in Europe. So just to give an example of a few days that we stop the activities, how much it changes the concentration of all those, or one of the greenhouse effect gases in our atmosphere. And so by seeing this example, we can start thinking about measures to mitigate those consequences of climate change. And we start thinking like that should be like in a global scale, that it's a government thing. But if we start doing better choices, we can also make a difference in those situations. And if everyone do a little bit, at the end, we can have things like this and start reducing our consequences. So with this, we actually finish not only this meeting today, but also the course. So we covered everything we were supposed to for this course. And before you all leave, I just want to say once more, thank you so much for being here with me during the summer. I know that it's a really intense course and 5 last weeks, but I hope it served you in any kind of like way to learn something new or to instigate your curiosity to learn more about all those topics. I hope to meet some of you next semester back on campus. If you ever pass through me, say hi. I probably don't know how you look like because I didn't see most of you this semester. But if you ever see me on campus, just stop by and say hi. I have my office probably in Woodward. If you want to stop by and say hi as well, will be a pleasure to talk with you.